The evening light slid low over the rooftops, gilding the dust that swirled along the narrow main street. Heat clung stubborn to the boards of the buildings, the air heavy with the scent of horses and fried onions drifting from the tavern. She stood near the hitching post, her hands folded at her waist as if they could hide her. The fabric of her dress, once the pale blue of morning skies, was faded and stretched at the seams. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the scuffed toes of her boots, because looking up meant meeting the smirks, the sideways glances, the murmurs that seemed to travel like the wind itself. Her husband's voice cut across the square, loud enough for every ear. He was a lean man with quick movements, restless as a weasel, wearing the kind of smirk that made her shrink without meaning to. His hat was pushed back, his eyes bright with the thrill of his own cruelty. He spoke of her as if she were a wagon too heavy to pull, a worn-out plow, a poor bargain he was eager to be rid of. The word fat rolled from his tongue with a flick of disgust, and a ripple of laughter answered from the edges of the gathered crowd. She swallowed, steadying herself. There was no point to protest, it would only stoke their delight. Somewhere in the shifting press of faces, she glimpsed the tavern woman leaning against her doorway, arms folded tight, gaze shadowed with pity. An old peddler with a beard like tangled rope shook his head, muttering something about how wheat grew best in deep soil, but no one was listening. Her husband turned a slow circle, as if presenting livestock for bidding. His words came sharp, promising she could cook, she could mend, she was useful enough if you didn't mind the heft. A young man snorted into his hand, and a few boys at the back elbowed one another, grinning. She wished the boards under her feet would open and swallow her whole. A man stepped forward from the edge of the square. He wasn't smiling. His hat shaded most of his face, but the set of his jaw spoke of someone who did not come here for entertainment. He stood still a moment, looking at her, not the way the others did, no scanning of her frame, no narrowing of eyes in judgment, but as if he were searching for something invisible. His boots were dusty, his coat worn, and yet he carried himself with a quiet gravity that drew the air tighter around him. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask questions. He reached into his pocket, counted out coins into her husband's open palm, and said in a voice that was almost soft, "You're coming." Her husband laughed, but it was a startled laugh, and perhaps that was why he didn't press for more. Money changed hands, and just like that, she was no longer his problem. The crowd's interest waned. Someone spat into the dust, another turned back toward the saloon doors. She looked up at the stranger, uncertain. His gaze met hers briefly before turning toward the waiting wagon. Without flourish, he lifted her small bundle of belongings, so light it might as well have been a loaf of bread, and set it inside. She climbed after it, the boards creaking under her step. He took the reins, clicked to the team, and they moved away from the square, the murmurs fading behind them. The wagon rolled through the thinning light. Fields opened out on either side, sun-bleached grass whispering in the wind. She sat with her hands in her lap, feeling the wheels jolt over stones, wondering what bargain she had just stepped into. The man said nothing for a long while. She studied the lines on the back of his neck, the way his shoulders carried a weight that wasn't from the coat he wore. By the time he spoke, the town was a smudge behind them. He said his name, plain and without expectation. Then, as if to explain, he added, *5 young ones at home. They need someone steady. He didn't look at her when he said it, as if the truth was not in the telling but in the living. She didn't answer right away. The idea of children stirred something tender and aching in her, though she'd never had her own. She thought of how quiet her nights had been, how empty her mornings. Yet she also knew the cost of being needed only for what you could do, not for who you were. The sun was sliding low when the wagon turned onto a rutted lane. A windmill spun lazily ahead, and beyond it, a weather-worn house crouched against the sky. Chickens scattered as they approached. On the porch, 5 figures huddled together, shapes small and large, a crooked stair-step of ages. The wagon halted, and a man called a name. The eldest, a boy nearly grown, stepped forward first, his face shuttered with suspicion. The littlest, a barefoot girl with hair in wild curls, peered from behind him. The others hung back, their eyes flitting between the stranger in the wagon and the man who had brought her. He helped her down, his hand warm but brief against hers. The children didn't speak, only watched as she smoothed her dress and tried to stand a little taller. She wanted to smile, but something in their guarded stillness held her quiet. The smallest girl broke first, darting forward to clutch at the hem of her skirt. Her tiny fingers curled into the fabric as if afraid it might blow away. The woman bent slightly, resting her palm over that little hand, feeling its fragile heat. A shadow crossed the yard, the eldest boy stepping closer, his eyes searching her face for an answer to a question he hadn't asked. She met his gaze without flinching, though her heart was pounding. There was a language in that look, a silent bargain. He would decide for himself if she belonged here. The man cleared his throat. "Supper's waiting," he said, and the children followed him inside, their movements a mix of curiosity and caution. She lingered a heartbeat longer at the wagon, glancing back toward the open road. The sky was deepening into the color of bruised plums, and the wind carried the faintest smell of rain. For the first time in months, no one was looking at her as if she was something to be measured, appraised, or dismissed. But neither did she yet feel safe. She was between worlds, the old one that had cast her out, and the new one that might take her in if she proved herself worthy. She stepped toward the porch, each board underfoot letting out a tired sigh. Inside, the light was warm, the air thick with the scent of bread and stew. She caught the children's whispers as she entered, the creak of chairs, the scrape of spoons against bowls. And then she saw it, above the mantel, in a small wooden frame, a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a smile like morning sun. The way the man's gaze lingered on it told her everything. Whoever she had been, she was gone, and yet her absence filled the room like breath. The woman who had just been bought understood, in that quiet instant, that she was walking into more than a house with 5 orphans. She was stepping into the space left by someone whose place could never truly be taken. And in the hush that followed, with the rain beginning to tap at the windows, she realized this might be the hardest bargain she had ever made. The rain fell through the night, tapping at the shutters and drumming a slow, even hymn on the roof. Morning came pale and damp, the yard dark with wet earth. She woke to the faint clink of cups and the smell of coffee winding through the small house. The man's voice murmured low in the kitchen, speaking to one of the children, his words plain and without the lift of laughter. She sat up on the narrow bed in the small back room, gathering her hair into a loose knot, listening as the floorboards carried the weight of feet from one end of the house to the other. When she stepped into the kitchen, the children paused mid-motion to study her. The eldest boy, sleeves rolled to his elbows, was drying tin plates with sharp, efficient movements. A girl of maybe 12 lingered near the stove, turning bread in a skillet. The littlest 2, one no more than 4, the other a solemn 6, sat at the table with their hands folded on their laps. Only the middle boy, about 10, dared a small smile before ducking his head. The man looked up from the stove, met her gaze briefly, then nodded toward the empty seat. She sat, folding her hands as the children had, unsure of the house's unspoken rules. Breakfast passed with quiet scraping of forks and the occasional sound of a chair shifting on the plank floor. She noticed how the man watched the children more than his own plate, making sure each had enough. When the littlest spilled milk, he simply handed her a cloth, no scolding, no sigh. It was a small thing, but it lodged somewhere in her chest. Afterward, the house loosened. The older children drifted toward chores without being told, moving in that way of those who have learned to keep themselves busy. She followed the man out to the barn, unsure if she was meant to, but he didn't turn her away. The air inside was warmer, smelling of hay and the sweet musk of horses. Dust motes drifted in the light spilling from a high window. He moved with quiet certainty among the stalls, checking each animal as if their well-being was part of his own. She offered to help, her voice low. He handed her a bucket without looking directly at her. Together they worked, she scattering feed, he hauling water. The rhythm steadied her, the scrape of grain against wood, the swish of a tail. At one point, he asked if she could handle a horse. She told him she could, though she'd never owned one. He nodded once, then showed her the mare that would be hers to care for. The trust, small as it was, pressed against the hollow she'd been carrying. By midday, the clouds thinned, and sunlight spilled across the yard. She hung damp laundry on the line, feeling the wind tug at the fabric. The children passed her in pairs, carrying pails or armloads of wood. Now and then one would glance at her, quick, measuring looks, as if deciding whether she might last here. She found herself speaking to them in small ways, asking the eldest girl about her bread, remarking to the middle boy on the strength of the wind. Each time, the responses were polite but cautious, like a door opening only an inch. In the afternoon, the man took her with him to the far field. They rode in the wagon, the road bumping beneath the wheels, the silence companionable. He pointed out the creek that marked the boundary, the stand of cottonwoods where the cattle sheltered in summer. She listened, storing each piece away as if she were being told a map of more than land. When they reached the fence, he set to mending a section worn thin. She held the post steady, her skirts catching burrs, the sun pressing warm against her shoulders. There was a steadiness in his work, a refusal to hurry even when the wire fought back. She thought of the men she had known, quick to anger, eager to prove. This one moved like someone who understood the worth of patience. It made her wonder what storms he'd weathered, what losses had taught him to build instead of break. The ride back carried a different quiet. She caught him glancing at her once, as if considering a question he might not yet ask. When they reached the yard, the children came running, voices high with news. The neighbor had stopped by, left a jar of preserves, and asked after the new woman. The eldest girl relayed it with a look that warned of more behind the words. Later, while shelling beans on the porch, that neighbor appeared again. She was a tall woman with a thin smile and eyes that roamed without rest. She greeted the man warmly enough, but when her gaze landed on the woman at the porch rail, her smile sharpened. The talk turned quick and cutting, how the town was still buzzing about the sale, how some men couldn't be choosy these days. The words wrapped themselves in feigned kindness, each one a needle slipped between the ribs. The woman on the porch kept her face still, hands moving over the beans. But she felt the children stiffen near her. The neighbor's laughter slid over the yard before she took her leave, satisfied with whatever mischief she'd planted. After she was gone, the eldest boy muttered something under his breath. The man's eyes cut to him, but he said nothing to stop him. Instead, he turned to the woman and said, "You don't have to answer folks like that." She met his gaze, something hard and warm sparking in her chest. "I know," she said. But that night, alone in her small room, she turned those words over, wondering if she believed them. The days settled into a kind of rhythm. She rose early, worked alongside the children, learned the way the ranch breathed from one hour to the next. She saw the man's patience in the way he taught the youngest to hold a hammer, his quiet pride when the eldest boy brought in the horses without being asked. And she felt, inch by inch, the edges of her own caution beginning to fray. Still, there were moments when the air in the room seemed to shift, a reminder that she was not yet rooted here. Once, she caught the eldest girl watching her with an expression she couldn't name, part doubt, part hope, part fear of hope. Another time, the middle boy slipped her a wildflower, quick as a secret, and ran before she could speak. These small offerings wove themselves into her days, fragile threads she didn't dare pull too hard. One evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, the man lingered at the table, studying a paper in his hands. The children drifted to the porch, their voices soft in the dusk. She was about to rise when he said, without looking up, "You know he might come back." The words landed heavy, the unspoken name of her husband settling between them like dust. She steadied herself against the table's edge. When he did look at her, his eyes were unreadable. "If he does, you'll have to decide where you stand." His tone was neither warning nor comfort, just fact. She felt the room tilt slightly, as if the choice were a path already waiting at her feet. Outside, the children's laughter thinned into quiet. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound stretching across the darkening fields. She realized then that her past was not gone, only waiting for its moment to step into the yard. And when it did, everything she had begun to build here, every cautious thread, would be tested. The mornings grew lighter, and with them, Her steps through the small house began to carry a sure rhythm. She no longer hovered at the edges of the kitchen, she moved through it with a quiet claim, setting bread to rise before the children stirred, ladling coffee into the man's tin cup without asking if he wanted it. He would nod once, a wordless acknowledgement, and take it out to the porch where the sky was still brushed with the faintest wash of dawn. The children began to orbit her more closely. The littlest girl would trail her through the yard, clutching the hem of her skirt as if it were a tether. The middle boy took to bringing her treasures, a smooth riverstone, a crow's feather, a single apple he'd saved from his own portion. Even the eldest boy, guarded as a locked gate, began to let his eyes linger when she spoke, as though measuring her truth against the weight of her actions. She spent her days stitching small repairs into the fabric of the ranch. A hem straightened, a fence mended, a stubborn latch coaxed to close. She taught the eldest girl to cut biscuit dough with the rim of a glass, showed the youngest how to braid her hair so it stayed neat for chores. They were small acts, but they made the air in the house feel different, warmer in ways that could not be marked on a calendar. One afternoon, she found the eldest boy struggling to wrestle a halter onto a colt. He moved with the sharp frustration of someone who had been taught to expect only his own strength to serve him. She stepped quietly beside him, laid a hand on the rope, and whispered for him to slow. Together they worked the colt's skittish energy into stillness. When the halter was on, he didn't thank her, just gave a short nod, but it was the kind of nod that meant more than any words. The man noticed these shifts, though he said little. Sometimes she would catch his gaze lingering just long enough for her to feel it, then slide away as if he hadn't been looking at all. At supper, when the children laughed at something she said, his mouth would tilt at the corners, the briefest shadow of a smile. She wondered if he realized how those small mercies steadied her more than anything. Still, the wound of her past lived close to the surface. A neighbor woman stopped by one morning with a basket of eggs, her words dripping with the sort of sweetness meant to sting. She spoke of hearing the woman was settling in nicely after such unusual circumstances, her glance skating over her frame as though cataloging every perceived flaw. The woman swallowed her anger, kept her hands busy wiping the counter, but inside, the old shame stirred, curling like smoke. She found refuge in the barn that afternoon, burying her hands in the work. The man found her there, mending a saddle strap with tight, even stitches. He leaned against the doorframe, watching for a moment before saying, "Some folks talk because it's the only work they know how to do." She didn't look up. "It's easier to pretend it doesn't matter," she said. "It will matter less when you believe it less," he answered, then left her to the quiet. The turning point came on a wind-sharpened evening. The youngest boy, chasing the dog too close to the edge of the yard, slipped on loose stones and gashed his knee. He came to her crying, blood bright against the dust. Without hesitation, she gathered him into her arms, carried him to the porch, and set about cleaning the wound. Her voice was low, steady, the same rhythm she might have used to soothe a fevered child in the deep of night. The other children clustered around, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with a dawning recognition of something they had been missing. Later, the boy limped toward the barn where the man was working, his knee neatly bandaged. "She fixed me," he announced. The man's gaze slid past the boy to the woman standing in the doorway, her hands still damp from washing away the blood. He gave that slow nod again, but this time, it seemed to carry a quiet gratitude. Days folded over one another, and the ranch began to feel less like a place she was passing through and more like a place she might belong. She learned the sounds of it, the creak of the windmill at night, the lowing of cattle at dawn, the laughter of the children in the far pasture. The land asked much, but it gave back in ways she hadn't expected. Yet, the past was not done with her. One morning, while she was hanging laundry, she saw a rider on the horizon. The shape was small at first, shimmering in the heat rising from the grass. But as it drew nearer, the gait of the horse, the angle of the hat, the careless way the man sat in the saddle carved a cold path through her chest. She knew him. Even at a distance, she knew him. The basket in her hands grew heavy. The clothespin between her fingers trembled. She forced herself to keep hanging the shirts, one after another, though the sky seemed to tilt above her. The rider did not turn toward the house but passed along the fence line, slowing enough to glance in her direction. She couldn't read his face from where she stood, but she didn't need to. The message was in the very fact of his presence. He knew where she was now. That night, the air inside the house felt charged, as if everyone sensed something they couldn't name. The man said nothing about the rider, though she noticed his eyes flick toward the window more than once. The eldest boy stayed close to his younger siblings, his shoulders squared in quiet watchfulness. When the children were in bed, she stepped onto the porch. The stars were sharp and bright, the air cool on her skin. She could see the yard laid out before her, the fence line a dark seam against the land. Somewhere out there, she imagined, he was waiting, whether in body or just in the shadow he'd cast over her mind. She wrapped her arms around herself, unsure if it was the night air or the thought of him that made her shiver. Behind her, the door creaked, and the man stepped out, standing beside her in silence. After a long moment, he said, "If he's come looking, he'll find I don't scare easy." His voice was even, but there was a steel under it she hadn't heard before. She looked at him then, really looked, and realized this was not only his warning to her, it was his promise. Still, a question burned in her mind unspoken. When the past finally stepped onto this porch, would she be able to stand beside him? Or would the shame he'd found her in still have the power to pull her back? The wind came in restless from the west that morning, bending the cottonwoods until their leaves flashed silver. She was in the yard with the youngest girl, hanging damp sheets, when hoofbeats cut through the air, too deliberate, too slow to be passing by. The rhythm thudded into her chest before the rider even came into view. When he did, her hands went cold. He sat his horse the way she remembered, one knee cocked, rein loose in his palm, that half-grin playing at his mouth as if the world were his for the taking. Her husband. The man who had sold her like a crate of bruised apples. His eyes swept over the yard, lingering on her as though she were still his to measure. The girl at her side pressed closer, sensing the shift in her breathing. She set the basket down, forcing herself to stand straight. He drew the horse to a stop a few paces from the fence, letting the animal's breath plume in the cool air. "Well now," he said, his voice as she remembered it, oiled with charm, sharpened with cruelty. "Ain't you landed soft?" His gaze flicked toward the house. "And quick, too." Before she could answer, the rancher stepped out from the barn. His presence changed the air, steadied it. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He came to stand between her and the fence, his eyes fixed on the rider. "You're trespassing," he said, calm as if he were naming the weather. Her husband laughed, that short, ugly sound. "Come now, I've come from my wife. And from where I sit, you've been keeping her without asking." The rancher didn't move. "She doesn't belong to you. She's my wife by law," the man snapped. "You can't change that with a pile of orphans and a hero's face." The girl beside her clung to her skirt. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips, the old fear pressing hard against her ribs. But beneath it was something new, heat, not from shame but from the knowledge that this man would take her only if she let him. "She won't be going anywhere with you," the rancher said, each word slow and measured. Her husband's smile thinned. "You planning to stop me?" "If I have to." The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of saddle leather. Then the rider leaned forward in the stirrups, his eyes narrowing. "You think she's yours. You think she'll stay. But I know her better than you do. She's always been easy to." "Enough," she said. Her voice startled them both. It rang harder than she intended, but she didn't pull it back. She stepped forward, the girl's fingers slipping from her skirt. "You know nothing about me," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough for the wind to carry. "You knew the shape of me, the sound of my voice when I was afraid. You never knew my worth. And you never will." His face flickered, anger, surprise, the quick dart of calculation. "You've grown bold with someone to hide behind." She shook her head. "No. I've grown bold because you are no one to fear anymore." For a long moment he stared at her, the reins twisting slowly in his hand. Then he spat into the dirt, wheeled the horse, and trotted back toward the road. The sight of his back was a relief and a dread all at once, because a man like him didn't come this far just to turn away for good. The rancher didn't speak until the rider was only a dark smear against the horizon. "He'll be back," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know." In the days that followed, the house seemed to hold its breath. The eldest boy kept the younger ones closer. The man began checking the fences more often, riding the far pasture before dawn. She worked as she always had, but the shadow of that meeting followed her, slipping into the quiet hours. One afternoon, the eldest girl asked if she was scared. She almost lied. Instead, she said, "Yes. But fear doesn't mean I'll run." The girl seemed to weigh this, then handed her a wildflower before darting away. It was near sundown when her husband returned. This time he came up the road openly, as if daring the whole world to watch. A few townsfolk trailed behind at a distance, drawn by the scent of spectacle. He dismounted at the gate, calling her name like a man announcing his prize. The rancher came from the barn, stopping short of the fence. "I've spoken to the sheriff," the rider said. "He says the law's on my side. She's mine till I say otherwise." "She's free to choose," the rancher answered. The man's eyes slid past him to her where she stood in the yard. "Tell him, girl. Tell him you're coming with me. Or has this place made you forget where you belong?" The children were behind her now, silent, their faces pale. She felt them like a wall at her back. And she understood in that instant that leaving would not just break her, it would break them too. "I am where I belong," she said. Her husband's face hardened. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," she said. "But not as much as I regretted staying with you." The onlookers shifted, the murmur of voices passing like wind through grass. He seemed to feel the weight of their eyes. His mouth twisted, searching for something to win him back the ground he'd lost. But before he could speak, the rancher stepped forward, placing himself fully between them. "You've had your say. Now leave." Her husband's gaze flicked from one to the other, a long, searing look meant to linger. Then he swung into the saddle, his movements sharp, and rode off toward town. The murmurs faded with the sound of his horse. The rancher stayed by the fence a long moment before turning to her. In his eyes she saw no triumph, only the steady acknowledgement of a fight not yet finished. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. She lay awake, listening to it, knowing he would not let the matter rest. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, the sound rising like a warning. She understood now that her freedom would not be given, it would have to be kept. And keeping it might cost more than she had ever imagined. Dawn broke sharp and pale, the light spilling over the yard like water over stone. She was already awake, sitting at the small table with her hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. The rancher moved quietly through the kitchen, boots soft on the boards, eyes fixed on some far point beyond the window. Either of them spoke. There was nothing left to guess. Today would bring the reckoning. Word had spread through town that her husband had gone to the sheriff, waving his claim like a flag. She could picture him there, spinning his tale, painting himself as the wrong party. And she could see the sheriff's face too, cautious, maybe even leaning toward the man with the louder voice. That was how the world often worked. But she had learned something in these months. Silence could be sharper than shouting if wielded right. By mid-morning, a rider appeared at the edge of the lane, calling them to a gathering in town. Her stomach tightened. The rancher met her eyes, gave the smallest nod. It was both question and answer. She fetched her shawl, the one that still carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and together they climbed into the wagon. The town's main street was lined with faces. Some curious, some hard, some pitying. The air was thick with the dust of too many boots in one place. The sheriff stood near the steps of the meeting hall, his hand raised for quiet. Her husband was there too, leaning against the rail, a smirk tugging at his mouth. He looked her over slowly, as if the months apart were just a pause in his ownership. Inside, the hall smelled of pine boards and the faint tang of lamp oil. People filled the benches, hats in their laps, voices low. The sheriff called them forward, his voice clipped with authority. "We're here to settle a matter of rightful claim," he said. Her husband stepped up first, his words smooth, practiced. He spoke of vows, of law, of the shame she'd brought him. He didn't mention the sale, not the way it had been, but dressed it in talk of hardship, of doing what needed doing. She listened without flinching, though each lie was a stone thrown at the walls she'd been building inside herself. When it was her turn, she rose slowly. The boards under her feet creaked, the sound loud in the hush. "I was not a wife to him," she began, her voice steady. "I was a weight he did not want to carry. He traded me for coin. He made me less than human in the eyes of those who watched. That is the truth." A murmur swept the room, sharp enough to make her husband's jaw tighten. She went on. "Since that day, I have worked this man's ranch. I have cared for his children as if they were my own. Not because I was claimed, but because I chose to. There is a difference." She let her gaze travel over the crowd, meeting eyes where she could. "A marriage is not a chain you drag behind you. It's a bond made of respect. Once it's broken, there is nothing left to carry." Her words hung there. Somewhere near the back, the tavern woman nodded, her mouth set in a firm line. The old peddler leaned forward, eyes bright under his brows. The sheriff shifted, glancing between them. Her husband laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "Fine talk," he said, "but the law's on my side." The rancher stepped forward then, his voice low but carrying. "The law's here," he said, "but so are the people. They can see a man who sold his wife and still thinks she owes him her life." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The sheriff cleared his throat. "I've heard enough," he said finally. "The lady's free to stay or go as she chooses. That's the end of it." It was a simple sentence, but it cracked something open inside her. Her husband's face went red, his hands curling into fists. He muttered a curse, then shouldered his way through the crowd, the door banging shut behind him. The room exhaled. She stood very still, feeling the weight that had pressed on her for so long begin, at last, to lift. Outside, the sun had warmed the street, melting the morning chill. The children were there, clustered by the wagon. The littlest ran to her, wrapping arms around her waist. The eldest boy gave the smallest nod, the same one he'd given her in the pasture months ago. She returned it in kind, understanding that, in his way, it meant he trusted her now. They rode home in quiet. The road unrolled ahead, the sky vast and blue. She felt the land opening around her like a held breath released. At the ranch, the children scattered to their chores without being told. The youngest girl lingered, slipping her hand into hers. Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee. The rancher poured 2 cups, slid one toward her. "You're already where you belong," he said, no more than that. She held his gaze a moment longer than she had before, finding no need to fill the quiet between them. As evening settled, they all gathered around the table. The lamplight pooled warm across their faces, shadows softening the edges of the day. Laughter rose in bursts, small, unforced, weaving itself into the rafters. She looked at each of them in turn, seeing not just what they were but what they might become together. Later, when the dishes were washed and the children tucked into bed, she stepped out onto the porch. The stars were sharp above the dark line of the hills. The wind was gentle now, brushing against her face like a benediction. She thought of the girl who had stood in the square months ago, head bowed under the weight of other people's judgment. That girl was gone. She knew her husband might still try to trouble her, that the past had a way of circling back. But she also knew this: she was not the woman he had left behind. She was rooted now, in this land, in these children, in the quiet steadiness of the man who had seen her not as a burden, but as someone worth bringing home. The door opened softly behind her. The rancher stepped out, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Either of them spoke. They didn't need to. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its voice rising through the cool night. She stood listening, her heart steady. Whatever came next, she would meet it here, with these people, in this place. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what the morning might bring.